Hi, everyone. We'll just let people start joining here, and I'll start my little talk in a second. Okay. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides here. Welcome to the Invasive Species Center webinar series. My name is Madison Sturba, and I'm the Training and Outreach Intern at the Invasive Species Center, and I'll be your moderator for today's special webinar. Today's webinar is titled Research, Awareness, and Community Science, Limiting the Spread of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid in Ontario. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Invasive Species Center honors the long history of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation people on the lands now known as Canada, and strives to show respect to their ancestors, their communities, and to them individually. The Invasive Species Center respectfully acknowledges that our head office is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Bechuana, and the Garden River First Nations, as well as the longtime settlement of the Métis people in the Robertson-Huron Treaty area. And just in case you didn't know, the Invasive Species Center is a not-for-profit organization that connects stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. We've got lots of really great invasive species resources on our website, including species profiles, best management practices, and recorded webinars. You can also sign up on our homepage for our newsletter, bi-weekly media scan, and event invitations, which is where you can hear about upcoming webinars. The last little thing to mention here is that if you're interested in invasive species and want to learn more, you can visit our website to sign up for updates on our new training program, which will be launching really soon. We'll have a few different courses available, so stay tuned for that, especially if you're interested in forest pests like Hemlock woolly adelgid. So before we get started with today's webinar, there's just a couple little things to mention. There will be a time for questions at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question at any time, just please type them in the Q&A box and I'll read them to both our presenters after they've both had the chance to present. If you're having technical difficulties at any time, please type them in the chat box or respond to the email found in your registration, and we will try to resolve that for you. We've also enabled closed captioning, so if you would like to follow along that way, you can turn that on with the closed caption button on your taskbar. Lastly, there will be a very brief survey following the webinar, so if you could take some time to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Ron Neville. Ron is a cervi biologist with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and is based out of Atlantic Canada in Nova Scotia. He's also a co-chair of the HWA Working Group Maritimes, which was established in 2017. The group is a collaboration of government and non-government agencies devoted to helping protect hemlock forests in Eastern Canada and collaborating on research, pest management, reporting, and public outreach. Our second speaker is Dr. Chris MacQuarrie. Chris is a research scientist with Natural Resources Canada in Sault Ste. Marie. He researches the risk and management of invasive species to Canada's forests. His recent work has been on Hemlock woolly adelgid, but prior to that, Chris spent most of the last 12 years focusing on emerald ash borer. His PhD is from the University of Alberta, and he has an MSc from the University of New Brunswick and a BSc from the University of Saskatchewan. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here and talking with us today about Hemlock woolly adelgid. I will pass it over to our first speaker, Ron.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Is my screen showing okay?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for the introduction. Today, I'll be starting off the webinar with a bit of background on HWA, as well as some biology, some impacts, and also share where HWA is currently found in Canada. So HWA, Hemlock woolly adelgid, Adelgis tsugae. Folks sometimes will call it Hemlock woolly adelgid. Sometimes others will call it Adelgid. Both are fine. It's an invasive species that's been introduced into Eastern North America and Western North America. It's an aphid-like pest, so it feeds similar to an aphid, but it really focuses on these storage cells, these starch and water storage cells that are in the twigs of hemlock trees. And it is a pest of hemlock. It doesn't attack any other species of any types of trees in North America. So this is a map that shows the distribution of hemlock worldwide, and you can see that there's 5 species, 5 different color ranges there in Asia. Those are 5 different species of hemlock in Asia, and then we have 4 different species in North America and 3 in Canada. So in Canada, of course, we have 2 species out west, the western and the mountain hemlock, and then in the eastern Canada we have eastern hemlock. And HWA is not a serious pest in its native range in Asia, in India, Japan, Taiwan, and China, and nor is it a significant pest on the west coast of North America. And the understanding is really that this is because of 2 factors. One is an action of predators. So there's predators that natural enemies that keep populations down, and there's also some host resistance in some of the species that are in the West and in Asia. And if you're looking at this map right now, all of these ranges of hemlock now have HWA present currently. So this is a zoom of eastern North America, and what you can see on this map is in green is the range of eastern hemlock in this part of the continent, and also on this map you can see in brown and then in yellow the areas where HWA has been found. So you can see it's established in much of the native range of eastern hemlock in the U.S., and then a little bit of the native range in Canada, in particular in southwest Nova Scotia. And if you squint really hard, you can see a couple of little spots there in Ontario that are on this map as well. So it was found first in eastern North America. It was confirmed in the 1950s in the Virginia area. It's probably been there for a little while before it was confirmed there. And the thought is that it was imported there through some plant material that came in from Japan. So some nursery plants from Japan, hemlock trees were imported in that area, and they brought the pest in with them. So its impact on trees is quite significant. It defoliates, causes twig dieback and mortality in host trees in as few as 4 years. We usually cite a reference of about 4 to 10 years. But sometimes trees can be infested for longer, and they'll just linger in the environment, stressed, but nevertheless in the environment for up to 20 years. Of course, hemlock is a very important species ecologically. It's a foundational species in the forest, and there's many species that rely on it for their existence. All sizes and ages of trees can be attacked. So anything with foliage is a host for HWA. And it feeds and kills the buds first and then the needles. So the feeding really stresses out each twig, and then the terminal bud will die, and then the tree just won't be able to keep growing. And then eventually the tree will die. And drought and other factors like bark beetle infestations and things like that can hasten the impact of HWA. So here's a few. I'm going to show a few pictures of. These are taken in Nova Scotia. So this is a picture that was taken. It's a river called the Sissebu River in Nova Scotia. It was taken in June of just this past summer, and this is I could fly over southwestern Nova Scotia and probably take 80 pictures like this easily. There's many areas that are along the rivers that show this kind of decline. You see kind of the gray decline of the trees. Just a few other shots. This one happens to be around the same time frame in a community called Bear River, which has a lot of hemlock there. And then finally, this is another location in Nova Scotia. This one is in Yarmouth County, so it's just another location there. This is one of the areas that we first found HWA in 2017. And when we did find it in 2017, it had been declining already, and probably had been there for at least 10 years before we found it in this site. So, so how does it spread? Well, we know that it spreads naturally at least a few kilometers per year. And it'll do that through the wind, through bird movement, and through mammals. But long distance spread is where humans are really responsible for that. And humans that are moving things like infested nursery stock or firewood or other forest type products that might have life stages on them, then we can certainly move it really, really long distances. A little bit about the biology of HWA. So it's a bit of a complex life cycle, but basically you have a population that's attacking hemlock trees. It's all female. They can reproduce asexually. So there's no mate finding at all necessary for them to establish and succeed on host trees. So you can just have one individual pops up in a new area, and it can create a population if the conditions are right. And then further to that, it has 2 generations per year, quite a few eggs the first generation, and then fewer the second. So you have this huge capacity under the right conditions for populations to really explode and get really big really, really quickly because of this. In Eastern North America, we don't have any natural enemies that are really effective in controlling HWA. And there's little resistance that's been found in Eastern hemlock to date. There are a few little projects underway in the States where they've, for example, there's a stand in New Jersey that seems to be showing some resistance to attack. So there's some folks doing research on that to see if there's a possibility that we might be able to like take some of the genetic traits that are in those trees and propagate them and see if we can get some Eastern hemlock that can survive. But that's kind of early stages of those projects. So this is what the 2-year life cycle would look like if I just mapped it on a 12-month circle. And so there's one generation that takes about 9 months to go, and then there's another generation that takes 3 months to go. And so if you look at this this circle, you'll see that you're looking at egg laying. If you look at the yellow circle, you can see eggs laying in June, and then they hatch into crawlers, and then they actually go to sleep. That generation goes to sleep for the summer, and then wakes up in the fall and starts feeding, and then feeds all fall and winter, and then will lay eggs again in the spring. So that's kind of the life cycle. Now, there is a kind of an interesting thing that happens with this pest in its native range, is that one of the generations will produce winged adults that fly off to spruce trees, and they mate, and they feed in spruce for a bit, and then they come back to hemlock. But we don't see that in North America at all. So our spruce trees in North America are not affected by HWA. So I'm just going to show a little bit about these different life cycles. There's the life stages, sorry. So if I start with the eggs, which is up in the top left there, so I've got, those are woolly egg sacs. So you can't really see the eggs in there. They're kind of covered by this woolly egg sac. So after the egg hatches, it goes into a straight stage that what we call the crawler. And this is like really, really tiny. And really what you're looking at is really like small bits of ground up pepper. That's kind of the size that we're talking about. And these are really small. And this is, but they're really abundant, and they're very, they're easy to move. So they can be moved in the wind. They can get up on birds. They can get up on, a deer brushing up against a branch. They can get on you, onto your firewood. They can get onto a whole bunch of different things. And this is kind of the main mobile stage that, as far as the natural spread of HWA goes. And so what they do, though, these crawlers, they hatch, and then they really want to set up shop on a hemlock tree so they can feed. So what they do is they hatch and they crawl out to the new growth of the hemlocks, and they find a good feeding site at the base of a needle, and then they insert their mouth part into the twig, and then that's where they're going to stay for the rest of their life. So once they've set up shop on a twig, and they look at that little nymph stage, which basically looks a bit like a sesame seed with a little white halo around it. So it's really, really tiny. And they're set up there, they're starting to feed, and they're not going to go anywhere for the rest of their life because that's their mobile stage is done. So it's just that crawler stage that's really mobile. I guess the other thing I wanted to mention is that once they start feeding, they might go to sleep if they're the summer summer generation, and then feed in the fall, or if they're in spring generation, they'll just not go to sleep and just feed. And while they're feeding, they'll start producing this wool, this waxy material on their back, and that'll start covering them, and that's going to be really helpful for them to sort of protect from getting dried out in the sun, keep their eggs from drying out, and it does provide a little bit of protection from predators as well. So this is just a picture of some crawlers. Again, you have to squint to see them, but I circled them there in red. They're pretty tiny, but there's lots of them, and they don't live too long. I think there's some studies that show they might live up to a week in different situations. But remember, you only need one to travel to another hemlock tree to start a population. This is a high magnification of an adult, and it's perhaps not as attractive as a spotted lanternfly. However, it is pretty cool looking, and it does have one neat structure that I wanted to show in this, and that's the feeding, the stylet, the long stylet that it uses for feeding. And you can see it kind of curled up in this picture, and that's what it inserts into the twig, and that's what it uses to feed on these water and starch storage cells at the base of the needles in the trees. So, what can we do? What can the average person do with respect to HWA? And one of the things that we all can do is we can look for it and try and find it, and share what we find. So what should we be looking for? And one of the things that the easiest thing to look for is these egg sacs. They're the most obvious life stage, or the obvious sign that it's there. Usually they're on the underside of the twig. So when I'm looking at a tree, what I'll do is I'll be walking along and I'll flip the branch over and look on the underside, and I'll look for these white woolly egg sacs right on the twig. They're not like in the middle of the needle. They're always like on the twig, because that's where the nymph set up shop for feeding. The other thing I like to do when I'm looking for egg sacs is I look down on the ground, because often after a windstorm or after something, a bit of weather, you'll see a lot of little branches that have fallen from the crowns of hemlock trees. And it's really good to just look around on the ground and look for those. And you can pick them up and kind of turn them over and see if you see any white egg sacs. These are most obvious from late fall until about June. So that's when they're most obvious. So like early infestation, you might have it, but you might not see it. You might not see these egg sacs during the summer months. But after a tree's been really, really infested, you'll probably see some residual ones from a previous generation. So in those summer months, like right now, on the new growth of the hemlock twig, you're going to see these little sesame seeds that have set up shop, these astivating nymphs, these nymphs that are asleep, and they're if you might need a hand lens to see these, or a bit of light. Sometimes hemlock stands are a little bit dark. Early attack, most trees look pretty healthy, and so you might see a couple of woolly egg sacs, and then you might see some nymphs, but the foliage looks pretty healthy because the tree really hasn't started to decline yet. Now, when we're looking, we'll end up seeing other things at the same time. We'll see things like spider egg sacs. We'll see, fluff from other aphids or other Adelgid that are feeding in a stand. We might see some spittlebug, So all these little things they might look a bit like HWA. And so it's just something to keep in mind that, if you see some white fluff on a tree, what looks like it, it's a good idea to get it looked at by someone that has some experience, so that you can be sure that that's what you're looking at. What's the best way to report these things? Well, there's a bunch of different ways you could do that. I put a few of them here. The Invasive Species Center actually has a really great report a sighting kind of base page for folks to go to. So that's a good link to check out. You can go to the CFIA website and you could report it directly to us through that link, or you can contact Nicole and a survey biologist in Ontario, and by email, and she'll make sure that to follow up. There's two kind of online kind of apps that you can use. EdMaps is a great one. We recommend people use EdMaps. It's a really great way to report. And if you're, a lot of us are folks at iNaturalist, and that's an option for people too, for sure. Couple other thing that you could do is just be aware of the fact that if you happen to enter into a stand that's infested, you don't want to move it to a new area. And so if you happen to be walking in the forest in a hemlock stand that's infested, basically from April until the end of September, you could be getting crawlers on you, and you could be getting eggs on you. And so there's a few things that we recommend, things like being careful with your gear, wipe down equipment before you leave. We use lint rollers a lot, so we use lint rollers that we lint roll our legs and our backs and our hat, things like that. It's great for picking up ticks as well, so it's kind of double duty. Light colored clothing is good, but really the main one on this list, and it should be big and bold, is just launder your clothing before you re-enter the field. So if I'm going to be working in a hemlock infested stand, I'm definitely not going to be going back to a non-infested stand during the summer with the same clothing that I wore. I'm going to be laundering that and cleaning it before I go. There's a lot of collaboration going on with HWA with some really great organizations, whether it's CFIA, whether it's CFS, whether it's Parks Canada, where it's some of the great NGOs in Ontario and also in Nova Scotia. There's a lot of different organizations involved, and a lot of us are collaborating on outreach. So these are just a few examples of that. We have some signage, we have some pest cards, a lot of social media campaigns, really trying to promote people reporting. Just gonna mention our regulations just really quickly. So we do have regulations in place in Canada. It's regulated pest, and it's really intended to slow the long distance spread of HWA in Canada. And so what it does is that everywhere on this map that's orange is what's part of our regulated area right now. And what that means is that if you want to move hemlock material or firewood of all species from one of those areas into an area that's outside, then you should be contacting the CFIA first so that we can do an inspection and provide you a certificate, make sure that you're not spreading HWA when you do that. So that's the regulations that are in place for that. So I'm quickly going to share where we found HWA. The map that you're seeing right now is our survey map up to right now. Our survey is still not complete in Eastern Canada, but it's close. And so the blue triangles are areas where we've looked for HWA, have not found it. And then there's 2 red locations in Ontario where we have this year. And that's just the zoom of that area. And I'll show a better map of that in a sec here. The brown area is the distribution in the US. So Nova Scotia, the southwestern part is infested. The red dots are all places where we found it so far. In Ontario, we've had detections going back to 2012. So there are detections from 2012 to 2015, basically at a Tobacoke residence and then in the Niagara Gorge. These were all small populations that were dealt with either by removing and destroying the trees or removing and burning the trees. Since then, however, though, there's been larger populations found. So we have a site in Wainfleet. Last year, there was a site in Fort Erie that involved some privately owned properties, as well as a nature reserve. And then this past year, there's 2 locations that have come up. The one is Pelham, And again, that's a combination of some privately owned properties and a nature sanctuary. That site, there's a little bit of dieback that's been started. It's not a heavy infestation quite yet, is my understanding. And then that was picked up in June. And then in July, some colleagues there from CFS and the University of Guelph picked up a site in Grafton on the north side of Lake Ontario. And that site is a heavily infested site. HWA has been there for a bit, and there's a campground in the vicinity. So this is what that might look like if I showed it on a map. So we have that site in Grafton in the top of the map near Port Hope on my map, on my labeled map, and then the blue triangles are where we've looked, and that we do have some more survey data up in the north there that's not on this map, but we're just waiting for that to be entered into our system. So we do have some negative sites in that area as well. So and then down in the south, that Pelham site is just sort of west of Welland there. And so I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna pass off to my colleague Chris to take off with some of the great research that's being done by the folks at CFS and others.
Hey, Ron.
Yes.
There's like one survey question in the chat. Maybe you take that one because I think it falls on from what you were talking about the best. So
sure.
And I'll just share my screen.
Yeah, Ron, I can read you the question here real quick.
Sure.
When looking for egg sacs, at what height are they found? Is there concern that egg sacs are found higher in the tree, making it less accessible to find?
Good question. So they can be found at any level of the tree. Just depends on how it was introduced to that area. Sometimes trees will get infested in the crowns first. And so that's why I was suggesting people look on the ground, because you're getting a sample of the crown and you're looking for these little twigs that are on the ground. Sometimes trees that are next to a water course will get infested first because of the corridor kind of effect. But I've seen other stands where it's been low on the ground and we can't find it in the crown because maybe it was brought into that area with a deer and then it spread more on the ground level. I'd say more often than not, it seems to go into the crowns high up first and then kind of make its way down. The crawlers will rain down and kind of infest things below. But you don't need to be taking high pole prunes to assess your stand. If you're out there looking, you can do a pretty effective survey by just covering that area at the ground level.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ron. We'll continue with questions at the end of Chris's talk. So if you have anything else that you can think of for questions, just pop them in the Q&A box. Thanks so much.
Hi. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to give just a bit of a brief summary of some of the research we've been doing on hemlock woolly adelgid in Ontario. And this is some collaborative research out of with Natural Resources Canada and a bunch of different partners, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So if I can get my slides to change, there we go. So when we talk about a new invasive species and our response to it, we have sort of a survey detection response, which is to, what Ron was just sort of talking about. And then the research side for folks like myself, we talk about what can we do to generate new knowledge to help respond to the new invasive species. And so in terms of, for hemlock woolly adelgid, in terms of the research program we've kind of established and sketched out, we have short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. And our short-term goals are really about developing tools and tactics to help locate and manage and mitigate those new detections in those existing populations. So when we have a new find like at Coburg or at Grafton that we know, what can we do about it right now? In the medium term, we want to help develop tools to look at these at-risk sites and get stands ready for arrival and infestation. So places that we know the insect will probably go, but it isn't there yet. And so what can we do about it to get those ready? And in the long term, for an invasive species like hemlock woolly adelgid that is established and that is not going to be eradicated. So how do we develop tools to manage hemlock woolly adelgid as an established pest, like we would any other forest pest or any other pest of trees in a in Ontario. So we've been working on this for a while. The Forest Service, the Canadian Forest Service, has been working on this for quite some time. And then this goes back to even before the original, the first detection in 2012 in Etobicoke. And so with some stuff we've already completed, there's been a lot of work on development of sampling tools and techniques, and a lot of this was led by Jeff Vidgen and Jean Turgeon here at Great Lakes. Jeff did a lot of this work with collaborators in Upper New York State, looking at those populations where the insect's been for a bit longer. And Jeff is now based out of our lab in Atlantic Canada and working on the response in Nova Scotia. We a couple years ago, we developed a hemlock woolly adelgid management plan for Canada. This is written by Carolyn Emelson with input from folks in the Food Inspection Agency and from private industry and the CFS. What would do it if and when we found adelgid in Canada. More recently, we've looked at developing a biological control implementation framework for hemlock woolly adelgid. We'll talk a bit about biological control later. There's an entire hemlock woolly adelgid technical group with folks from different agencies and government. And then there's also a hemlock adelgid working group that was established and is chaired by Kathleen Ryan from Silvacon. And those folks really, and I think a lot of them are probably on this call today, what we might consider our stakeholders in responding to HWA. And this is just there's a lot of other stakeholders, certainly a lot of private folks with hemlock that are concerned. But in terms of the working group, these are the kind of folks that have sort of been guiding certainly our response and figuring out what are the priority questions for looking at and responding to hemlock woolly adelgid. And so we always want to sort of acknowledge them and their input on our processes and what we've been thinking about. So in terms of our specific research response to hemlock woolly adelgid, basically we're thinking about sort of three main areas, and that's assessing the risk, mitigating that risk, and then resilience. So basically, what could be impacted by HWA, which stands, which trees, what can be done to mitigate that, and then what can be done to resist the impacts of hemlock woolly adelgid. So our projects and the projects that we have ongoing sort of slot into those three bins, and the work that we want to do in the future as well. So I'll talk a little about the projects that we are doing, and then I'll talk a little bit about the end of what we'd like to get going in the next couple of years. So in terms of doing risk assessment, the first thing we've been looking at doing is development of a hemlock inventory for Southern Ontario. So the last complete sort of inventory for hemlock dates back to the 1970s. And so there are partial and incomplete inventory available from landowners in Southern Ontario. So various conservation agencies, municipalities, private landowners, FMLs have done their own hemlock inventories. And Kathleen Ryan has done incredible work to accumulate all of those and put them together into sort of one inventory, but those inventories weren't done all the same way. And there's gaps. There's places where we don't have inventory. So it's a question mark as to what the status of hemlock is in those areas. And before you can begin to assess risk, you need to know the resource at risk. You need to know what's there and how much of it do you have. And so that's what the inventory is for. So we established a collaboration with Ben DeVries at University of Guelph and applied for some money from the Forestry Future Trust to develop a new inventory using remotely sensed data. And it was actually this project that brought our CFS Guelph crew to the site at Grafton that actually made the detection of HWA. So they were actually in that stand just to survey hemlock. They were interested. It was one of the random sites that we had selected to collect some on the ground data that could be used to match the remotely sensed data to train an AI to find hemlock on the landscape. And the crew, the summer students and the MSc student from Guelph that we recruited for the project were actually ones that found the infested tree. So we were there trying to get ready for hemlock woolly adelgid, and we found it. So, and I think that's kind of the reason that we're all here today. So in terms of this project, our field data collection, we've had crews out all summer collecting data sort of within the range of hemlock in Ontario. And we've also obtained some existing data sets. So this data set that Kathleen's put together, and also some data sets that exist from the province to help us kind of build a machine learning tool that can help us identify where hemlock is in the landscape. And so this is Amy Shee's project and supervised by Ben. And so she's working, so we're kind of completed the data collection for this summer, and now the computer intensive work will start doing model development and validation through this fall and into the spring of 2023. And so we hope to have something sort of in the next year or two that we could use for this project. In terms of the next thing we're going to talk about is terms of risk mitigation. So how are we optimizing our survey and detection tools? So there's obviously a need for the best ways to find the insect and to tell people how to find it. So Ron talked a little bit about that when he was answering the question. And there's certainly multiple tools exist for detecting and monitoring HWA. There's just basic visual searches looking for the insect. There's different kinds of traps. There's the ball sampling method, which some folks might have heard of, and you see Victoria Fuster from our group here demonstrating that at the stand in Wainfleet. But knowing the best time and the best place to put these requires knowledge of the insect's phenology in Ontario, and then the best place to put these and the sampling techniques. So and then testing of new traps and detecting techniques as they come up. So in 2021 and 2022, we've begun assessing phenology in Ontario. We were using the Wainfleet site to do this. So looking at, what stages of the insect are present when on the landscape. And then in parallel to that, Victoria's been looking at methods to optimize the application of the ball sampling method. So what part of the tree, what time of year, it gives you the sort of best probability of detecting the insect. And then this summer, we started 2 new projects looking at sort of different detection techniques. The first is evaluating a trap out of Charlene Partridge's group at Grand Valley State in Michigan. This is a crawler trap, and it's a little trap that goes in the stand and actually detects the crawler stage of the insect as it falls out of the tree. And we were using this around Wainfleet and building on the work that Charlene's group has done. And it seems to work quite well in Michigan, and we've had some interesting results with it in Wainfleet, and there's a chance of perhaps this is another technique we can use to detect it. And then in collaboration with the Food Inspection Agency and the University of Guelph, looking at eDNA techniques, looking at collecting water samples from either in stands or actually water samples from modified lingering funnel traps to see if we can get environmental DNA of HWA. And we also have done some modeling work with Dennis Yamshinov and his folks looking at optimal allocation of survey resources between different federal and provincial survey agencies. So how do you build optimal surveys with different groups to try and find the insect surveying at the best place and the best time with the best allocation of resources? In terms of mitigation, we've been looking at insecticides, and this is so in terms of insecticides, there are a number of products registered for use in the US to control hemlock-woolly adelgid, and they work reasonably well. As of right now, there's 1 product registered for use in Canada. And so what we need in order to be able to see if we can bring those insecticides to this country is basically knowledge of the impact of the insect on the insecticide on the insect, and then the fate of those insecticides once they're applied to an ecosystem. What happens to them after they're no longer being used to kill HWA? So and this is information that's sort of necessary to make the kinds of applications that are necessary to get these projects registered in Canada. So this work began in Nova Scotia, and most of it's being done in Nova Scotia with John Sweeney and his group out of the Atlantic Forestry Center. So they've begun assessments of Zytec, which is a sprayed imidacloprid product, and the Imajet product, which is an injectable, in Nova Scotia in 2018, and then they added the triazin injected Azadirachtin product began in 2019, and then in 2021 we looked at we established a project looking at combination of triazin and Zytec. And so that was all done, and it's been done in Nova Scotia. In 2020, we established a site at the Petawawa Research Forest near Petawawa, Ontario. There's no HWA there, but we established a site because we were interested in looking at the fate of insecticides in Ontario forests, and this is in collaboration with John's group. And then in 2021, last fall, we established an insecticide trial at the Wainfleet site, we used the sprayed Zytec product, triazin, and then the combination of triazin and Zytec. And this fall, we'll take our first samples to look at the impact of those insecticides on the HWA population there. Finally, so talk about mitigation. Another tactics of a longer term prospect for control of hemlock-woolly adelgid in Canada is biological control program. So biological control is the introduction of predators or parasites of the invasive species to the invaded range. And there's been a lot of work done in the US to locate biological control agents, both in Western North America, where the insect is native, and overseas in the native range in Asia. And then to develop protocols for both rearing the insects and releasing them. So in 2021 in Ontario and 2022, we've done preliminary assessments in Ontario of the predator communities in hemlock, just looking at what's there, right? To see, are there any things that are eating hemlock-woolly adelgid or might eat HWA in Ontario? And then there's been ongoing studies since 2018 looking at the natural enemy impacts there, and that's work by Lucas Roscoe and Jeff Fidgen. And my understanding is they're sort of looking at publishing their first results here rather quickly. And then we've also developed this biological control framework for HWA in Canada. And that's sort of how would we do biocontrol for HWA in Canada? What would we need? How would we deploy it? What would the processes be? And so that's sort of a more longer term option for control of HWA in Canada. And then finally, talking about resilience, this is developing silviculture and management guides for Ontario hemlock. And so basically land managers, folks with small amounts of hemlock or large forests, need to know what to do in response to HWA, either before it gets there or when it does arrive. And so for Canada, there's no guides for both managers of either high value trees or small to medium sized forests, so parks or conservation areas. And there's no hemlock specific silviculture prescriptions like you might find in the silvicultural guide for sort of larger landholders. So in 2021, in collaboration with the working group that the folks I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, we held some workshops with those land managers and those FMLs to determine what their knowledge transfer needs. So what information did they need to know, and how would they like it packaged? And this is also work with the Invasive Species Center as well, I should say. And through that we identified sort of two required products. There's certainly a guide for land managers, and then a kind of an addendum or some extra information that would accompany the Ontario Silvicultural Guide. And so we have sort of two groups that are working on that. There's one led by Bill Parker and Victoria Fuster, who was sort of working on that product for larger landowners. And then Victoria's also working with the Invasive Species Center to develop excuse me, and this is with Mackenzie, to develop a guide for land managers for smaller landowners and individual trees. And what we're hoping is to have those guides ready in sort of early 2023, and those products available for folks, and sort of echoing some of these stuff exists for the States, but we're hoping that it'd be stuff more specific for Ontario and for Eastern Canada. So that's kind of a very brief rundown of our research response to sort of what we're doing now. There's some stuff we would like to do, and this is sort of the bottom box under proposed, and this is all in the same bins, right, of either assessing the risk to Ontario, mitigating, or doing resilience. And so I'll just talk briefly about the projects that we have sort of on deck and that we're hoping that we can get off the ground here soon. In terms of risk assessment, we need to know the range within hemlock woolly adelgid can survive in Ontario. We know weather and climate may limit where HW can reproduce and survive, and there's sort of existing climate models based on the climate tolerances of the insect from the US, and we'd like to sort of replicate some of those experiments on our Canadian populations to see if there's any changes that we need to adapt for. Could the insect survive further north than we think it can? We know we need to look at bird migration. Ron talked about this a little bit. We think that probably the primary cause of movement sort of into Canada, and certainly places like the Niagara and around the lakes, is by the movement of migratory birds that are picking up crawlers during the crawler stage during spring migration and introducing them into Canada. And so knowing those likely invasion points and how birds move into Canada and through those at-risk, through those infested places in the States, will help us guide sort of where to do that survey and detection work, because to assess the risk to different stands. And then all of that would eventually hopefully feed into a full risk analysis for Ontario, and sort of evaluate our ecosystems and our resources at risk from HWA, which eventually guide our future management and research responses. So kind of an iterative process of deciding what do we need to do next. In terms of mitigation, there's probably the need to develop a more extensive surveillance and monitoring network. As Ron sort of explained, hemlock woolly adelgid is really hard to detect, and it requires sort of extensive survey work, and anything that we could do to help complement what CFIA already does would go a long way to finding the insect before it has a chance to really build up, like we've sort of seen this summer at the Grafton find. And then in terms of there's probably a need to produce like the hemlock hedgerows and the other infrastructure necessary to support a biological control program. There's, as of right now, there's no ability to rear these insects sort of in the laboratory. So there's the need to be able to rear them on outside on trees on artificially created hemlock woolly adelgid infestations, to be able to grow biological control agents to release in places so that we can try and control the insect. And in terms of resilience, we need to sort of assess the silvicultural tactics for improving hemlock health and resistance. And we know that forest managers require advice on managing hemlock to limit hemlock woolly adelgid damage, but these tactics require testing in real forests. So this is building off work that's sort of been done in the US already, and this work started 15, 20 years ago, doing thinning and various other silviculture prescriptions on hemlock forests, and then looking at the resilience and the resistance of those forests to hemlock woolly adelgid. And there's the need to sort of repeat that work in Ontario, in Ontario forests and our climate, to be able to see, would we have the same impacts? Would we have the same effects on mitigating that HWA damage? So I'll just finish up sort of by talking about outlook, and I think it's apparently apparent that hemlock woolly adelgid is established in Ontario, and there's new introductions that will spread from the US and will probably increase their range over the next 10 years. I actually built the slide quite a while ago, so I now before we've had the find in Grafton, so I should probably update it. But what our action now, we can actually do stuff to mitigate that damage. So and just, you know, folks can start now by looking for HWA, by being aware of what's going on in their stands. And if you find something that you think is hemlock woolly adelgid, by reporting it through some of the tools that Ron highlighted in his presentation. So I can stop there, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you so much, Chris and Ron, for both of your talks. That was really great. There are a number of questions here, so I'll just read them out, and then maybe you can take turns answering them, or whoever wants to take a run at it. Someone did ask if we can pop up the slide of the close-up map of Ontario again. So Ron, I think that was for you. If you could just put that up, that would be really great. One question here, is there any correlation with age or size with number of years it takes to succumb to hemlock woolly adelgid?
That's a good question, and I should know the answer to that one, but I don't off the top of my head. Certainly the larger trees, there's more photosynthetic material there. There's more needles there to be able to still continue to grow and maintain itself when the infestation starts. What you do see is those crawlers, as they rain out, they will get on the little trees down below. And those little trees, because they don't have as much sort of photosynthetic material, should succumb quicker, just because they can't stand as much feeding. Would you agree, Ron? Or
yeah, well, anecdotally, that's what I see when I go through these stands, is those young ones just seem to succumb first. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. Okay, the next question, are the infestations found being eradicated?
So that's, I don't think there's any plans to do that.
Not the latest ones.
No.
They're just too big. They're too big. Like, eradication's not really the right word when you get these things established and into a large area.
Yeah.
But management is really where we want to go. And you know, it's not like finding a couple trees in someone's front lawn when you find it in the natural environment like that. Yeah.
Those early detections that Ron mentioned in Etobicoke and Niagara Gorge, certainly the one in Etobicoke was, those were trees from a nursery. They'd come and infested. They'd been sold to somebody and planted in their yard, and so it was a known thing that could be sort of identified and taken out. These other ones, these are large infestations that have been present for a long time, and unless you have very early detection, their ability to eradicate sort of is removed from your management toolbox very quickly.
Awesome, thank you. So do you think it's inevitable that HWA will colonize the entire range of eastern hemlocks in Ontario?
If you look at the climate survivorship models, it does say that there's a northern limit to where hemlock will, to where HWA should be able to survive. And that northern limit sort of falls somewhere within kind of cottage country Kawarthas, north of Lake Ontario. But that's based on sort of overwintering survivorship estimates that were done from populations in the US. And insects can show local adaptation to a region after they've been established, and certainly to the climate they experienced while they're being developed. So that's why we sort of look at, there's a need to reassess that based on these northern populations that we have now in Ontario, looking at where can they survive. Certainly, if you look sort of across into Michigan, there's HWA is surviving on the west coast of Michigan, lower Michigan, at a similar latitude or slightly further north. So there's the chance that it could go further north than we think it could.
Awesome, good to know. Is there a survey protocol for hemlock inventories you can share?
If somebody wanted to email me, we could certainly talk about that project. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Is there an eastern hemlock relative abundance below which it is unlikely that hemlock woolly adelgid will infest?
It's just a matter of where these crawlers arrive. So it's not about, so, you know, if you have a really isolated stand that's far away from a pathway to get there, then I guess it's a bit more protected. But when you throw birds into the mix that like to use hemlock as part of their ecosystem, it gets pretty challenging. So I don't feel, I don't know the answer to that, but I don't feel it's likely that we're going to find that in the landscape.
I would agree.
Okay, thank you. Are there any preliminary results or indications about the efficacy of pesticides or biocontrol?
So the evidence from the US, where they've been using the insecticides for quite a while, is that you do get reasonably good control of the insect with the insecticide. Some of the products that are available in the US aren't available in Canada and may not be, depending on the manufacturer's decisions. The efficacy of biological control it's one of those things that's still being looked at, where the insect has been, where the biological control agents have been established for a while. You do see them feeding on the populations, and you do have some indication of suppression. The projects have not been are sort of in that phase now, where the oldest introductions are at the point where you could maybe do those kind of assessments and be able to say, are we having a reduction in the size of the HWA population, and are we getting trees coming back?
Okay, thank you. What is the status of the guide being developed for managing hemlock in the face of HWA?
The first sort of publication from that we're hoping to have submitted, I would hope, by the end of the year. And then the subsequent one, I think, would be sometime in early 2023.
Awesome.
And I just add that Nova Scotia has a management guide that's draft that's available online that I can share the link for that. And they also have a best management practice pamphlet that might be of interest that I can share as well.
Oh, great. That's awesome. Thank you. This person asks, Chris, are there any particular bird species that have a higher incidence of picking up HWA and moving them via migration?
I don't know. That's an awesome question. I feel that's a MSc or a PhD project right there.
It would be great to know. The next question is, which molecular techniques for HWA detection are you currently exploring based on the eDNA sampling?
I don't have a great answer to that question. That I would probably pitch it to the folks we're working with at Guelph, who were collecting the water samples. The one method and processing the samples from the Food Inspection Agency's modified lingering funnel traps. The technique that we're trying with the trap out of Grand Valley State is it collects either crawlers or HWA eDNA, and then it's just a PCR amplification of the kind of, like, it's the trap is actually like microscope slides coated with petroleum jelly, and so it's extracting the DNA from that petroleum jelly and amplifying it. But I'm an ecologist, and that's where the DNA stuff stops for me. I have to work with people that know how to do this. So if you want to send me an email, I can certainly pitch it to the folks that know this stuff better than I do.
Awesome, thank you. This one person was just asking if, Ron, you could go to the slide beforehand where Lake Huron is visible.
Lake Huron. Sorry, you're going to have to help me. This one?
Yeah, that's the one we can see. That's Lake Huron.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. The next question here, is there any degree of resistance being displayed where the HWA has been established for several decades, or does it appear that 100% mortality can be expected, similar to the emerald ash borer?
So
I think, Ron, you touched on that in your slide about
it's really high. The mortality is very high. But like EAB, they're trying to find resistant trees and resistant stands. And there is some work being done definitely in the States where they've identified some stands that seem to have some resistance to HWA for some reason. So they're really looking at those. I can say anecdotally in our heavier hit areas, there's very, very little hemlock that's alive at all, but that's not research data that, so my sense is that it'll be a high percentage. What will be left in the landscape is a really good question. And doesn't seem like, it seems like there'll be some, but it doesn't, I can't really comment exactly how much.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of interest in the guides that you've mentioned. So yeah, people would love if you could share the links to those and just talk about who's leading the development of that.
Yeah, just that our Maritimes working group has been working on some guides with the province of Nova Scotia, and that's what I'll share. And we have an NGO that we work with, the Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute in Nova Scotia, that's been heavily involved in developing some of this material. So I'll send you the link for that after the talk.
That would be awesome.
And the stuff for Ontario is sort of being led. It's a collaboration between the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and CFS and the Invasive Species Center. So if someone's interested, they could send us an email and we can put them in touch.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Someone's asking if, Chris, you can share your email in the chat. They say they may be able to help with identifying HWA on birds through bird banding stations, which sounds pretty cool. And I think this is the last question. What is the likelihood of regeneration of hemlock in affected stands if biocontrol is successful?
That's a great research question. I'm not sure we have an answer to that one.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for speaking. You had both excellent talks and we really appreciate it. I'm just going to share my screen again really quickly here. So yes, thank you both again. Thank you everyone for attending and watching the webinar, taking time out of your day. Just a reminder to please take a couple of minutes to fill out our survey. We would really appreciate it. And our next webinar will be about the rapid response to European water chestnut in Ontario's Welland River, which will be next Wednesday on August 31st. So we hope to see you there. And thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. And I will stop sharing my screen.